On the 1st of September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. On the 3rd of September 1939, in support of the Polish ally, France and Britain declared war on Germany. So began the Second World War. On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded Holland, Belgium, and France. In a brilliantly planned offence, they cut off much of the French army and most of the British Expeditionary Force, trapping them at Dunkirk. Only a miraculous rescue saved the Expeditionary Force from annihilation. By using new tactics such as blitzkrieg, the Germans had conquered far more quickly and efficiently than they had anticipated. They achieved in 6 weeks what they had been unable to in the whole of World War I, invade and conquer France. Germany hoped, after this crushing success over France, that Britain would sue for peace. They had already knocked out over 1,000 of Britain's planes and greatly weakened her army during their support of France and the subsequent evacuation of Dunkirk. Hitler's deal offered to spare the United Kingdom and her colonies as long as they didn't try to stop further German advances. Many in the British cabinet wanted to accept this, but the new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, rejected the peace offering. So Hitler reluctantly ordered the invasion of Great Britain. The British did have one major advantage: the 34-kilometer stretch of water that separated the two opposing armies, and guarding this channel was the Royal Navy, at the time the largest navy in the world. The German plan was simple: knock out the Royal Air Force, allowing the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, to gain control over the skies of Britain. They would use this airborne superiority to bomb the British Navy from above. Then, with the Royal Navy suppressed, the seaborne landing of the English coast could begin. This plan depended on achieving 3 objectives. Firstly, gain aerial control over the skies. Secondly, stopping Britain's large manufacturing sector from creating more planes. And finally, have the German Navy build enough boats for the landing to take place. The invasion was provisionally planned for some time in mid-September, but was subject to achieving air superiority. The German plan needed good communication channels, as well as good planning from their leaders. However, Hitler was not wholeheartedly behind the operation, as his main focus was on his plans to invade Russia. As a result, he left much of the operational work to Hermann Göring and his Luftwaffe. The Germans had 3 main bombers available to them: the Heinkel 111, the Yonkers 88, and this, the Dornier 17, also known as the Flying Pencil, due to its thin fuselage. It wasn't a particularly good bomber, in that it was slow, short-ranged, and only offered its crew low protection against enemy fighters. However, despite all this, it was popular with aircrew and German commanders alike, due to its reliability and maneuverability. It was also structurally strong and could take more hits than other bombers of its size. The Heinkel 111 was once a formidable bomber. However, by the Battle of Britain, it was starting to show its age. Despite being heavily armoured and well armed, it was very underpowered and was slow and difficult to maneuver. The Yonkers 88 was Germany's most recent bomber, and the Battle of Britain would see its first use on a large scale. It was fast, versatile, and had a superb range, making it the RAF's most feared bomber. The Germans also had the Stuka dive bomber. This was a single-engine, short-range bomber which had been very effective in the previous Blitzkrieg campaigns, where Germany had ruled the skies. However, during the Battle of Britain, its lack of speed and maneuverability meant it was easy prey for British fighters. They would be withdrawn from the battle early on, after over 300 had been lost or destroyed. The British had this, arguably the most recognizable and famous plane of the war, the Supermarine Spitfire. It was one of the first next-generation fighter planes, being made of metal rather than woolen fabric. Its skin was constructed by melting stretched metal around the skeleton of the aircraft. It was maximized for speed, so had a 1030 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The wings were extremely thin, but their iconic shape helped them stay strong, even in a tight turn. The new manufacturing techniques needed to manufacture the plane were a problem in a war zone environment, and production of Spitfires was painfully slow. Only 1/3 of British fighter aircraft in the war would be Spitfires. In the hands of a good pilot, the Spitfire could be deadly, but the plane was notoriously difficult to fly and land in the hands of beginners. The aircraft also wasn't fuel injected, so couldn't go upside down or dive without the plane stalling due to a lack of fuel in the cylinders. This was especially problematic if the plane entered a spin, and it would almost always prove fatal. The real workhorse for the RAF was the Hawker Hurricane. It was far simpler than the Spitfire, made from wood and fabric around the metal frame. Despite this, it was still an effective weapon due to its ability to be built in large numbers. This was due to simpler construction methods and so made up 2/3 of RAF fighter aircraft. The plane was also fitted with the same Merlin engine as the Spitfire, as well as a similar propeller. The Hurricane, however, was arguably safer for pilots, as it had armor behind the pilot and between him and the engine. It was favored more by beginner pilots, as it was easier to fly, land, and was quick to repair. The job given to protect the German bombers went to this, the Messerschmitt 109. It was matched pretty well to the Spitfire, and in many ways had a lot of advantages over British aircraft. For one, the 109 was fuel injected, so it wouldn't stall in a dive or a loop. However, its wings weren't as strong compared to the Spitfire, so it couldn't turn as tightly. Its biggest failure, though, was landing. Due to its short wheelbase, 5% of all 109's build would be destroyed in landing accidents. The first main bombing raids began on the 10th of July 1940, with small collections of German bombers hitting strategic shipping lanes. In theory, the RAF had advantage as it was easier to shoot down bombers in clear skies. However, the RAF was trying to preserve fighters and crew for the defense of the mainland, so only a small collection of fighters would intercept, giving the Luftwaffe clear runs at their targets. Most of these early battles resulted in a worrying trend for the RAF. The Luftwaffe were generally coming out of most engagements on top, with the RAF suffering relatively high casualties. This success was being repeated on the ground. In the first 6 weeks of the battle, over 40,000 tons of Allied shipping were destroyed. These attacks would pale in comparison to what the Luftwaffe had planned next. On July the 18th, they started bombing on a scale never before seen. 100 bombers took off from France and set course towards Britain's airfields and factories. This attack, like many others, was conducted at night, which was great for concealing their actions against anti-aircraft fire and fighter aircraft, but terrible for precision bombing of targets. Sometimes they wouldn't even find the right location, missing the target altogether. From early on in the Battle of Britain, the Germans became aware of how effectively the British used radar. During the 1930s, Britain had set up an experimental new radar system, codenamed Chain-Home. It comprised of radar stations along the east, south, and west coasts of the United Kingdom. These gathered information about incoming aircraft, which was passed straight to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priority, where they could determine where the Luftwaffe were approaching from and how many bombers were incoming. This information was then passed on to Fighter Command, who would determine how many fighters were needed to intercept and which of the 4 Fighter Command groups these planes would come from. Each of these Fighter Command stations would then decide which of the airfields within its command needed to be scrambled. The long-range radar could detect planes 150 miles away, which included some areas over France and Belgium. However, these could not detect low-flying aircraft. A second array of short-range radar stations would detect these low flyers, but they only had a range of about 50 miles. The Germans knew the British had this technology, partly because they had it themselves, but they didn't have it on the same scale or have such an efficient network. The Germans realized if they could destroy this radar system, it would cause havoc in the British command structure and allow a far easier entry for German bombers. On the morning of August the 12th, 96 bombers were sent over to destroy some of the radar stations. However, only minimal damage was sustained, and the British had all but one of the stations back up and running by the following day. So when the German bomber fleet arrived, they were surprised to be intercepted by the RAF. The raid wasn't a success. Of the over 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft sent over that day, 49 were shot down or crashed, while the British only lost 18 fighters, with only 3 of those pilots being killed. Despite all the action taking place in the south of England, the north of the country had remained relatively untouched. The Germans assumed that there were no radar stations in the north, and that any fighters originally stationed there had been sent south to cover losses. This theory was tested on the 15th of August, as 151 unescorted bombers took off from Norway and Denmark. However, the British did in fact have radar and also several squadrons of mostly Hurricanes on standby. These engaged the Luftwaffe over the North Sea, and over 20 Luftwaffe aircraft were destroyed. This would be the first and only daytime raid over the North Sea. Despite this success, the strain of the relentless bombing of British airfields was starting to take its toll. By the 1st of September, many airfields only had a handful of experienced pilots. New pilots were only getting 9-10 hours flying time in modern planes before being sent into battle. Production of planes had now, for the first time, been outstripped by aircraft losses. The Germans were also struggling. So far, 229 German pilots had been killed or captured, with another 264 missing. So confidence was starting to run thin within its ranks. Luck was about to change for the RAF. On the 24th of August, a handful of German bombers accidentally bombed London. In retaliation, Britain's bomber force had been instructed to hit the German capital, Berlin. 11 raids were made, and although the casualties and damage were relatively low, Hitler was outraged. Hitler personally ordered that raids of London would commence to avenge the Berlin attacks. On September the 7th, these attack plans came to fruition, as over 1,200 German aircraft descended onto London's docks, setting fire to flammable warehouses, ships, and neighborhoods. After continued attacks on the capital and other large cities, it became evident to the RAF that the German strategy has changed. Despite taking a massive toll on the occupants of London, it was brilliant news for the RAF. This respite and non-bombing of airfields allowed time for the repair of aircraft, airfields, and gave the pilots and ground crew time to recover. Hitler had just shot himself in the foot. The climax of the Battle of Britain came on the 15th of September. The attack was designed to crush British morale and prepare the way for an invasion. German intelligence reckoned that the RAF must be down to its last 150 fighter aircraft. They were wrong. The RAF met every single German attack, resulting in some bombers leaving the field of battle early and heading back for France, emptying their loads over the channel as they went. 68 Luftwaffe aircraft were lost, destroyed, or crash-landed. In comparison, the RAF lost only half that amount, 34 aircraft lost or destroyed. It was a comprehensive victory for the RAF, and the 15th of September is now commemorated as Battle of Britain Day. 2 days later, Hitler declared that the invasion of Britain would be postponed indefinitely. However, German bombing of London continued for another 8 months until May 1941. These bombing raids destroyed 1/3 of London. 32,000 civilians were killed, as 21,000 tons of bombs were dropped in an attempt to destroy British morale. Many of Britain's other cities were also bombed. It was hoped the British people would petition the government to surrender. This surrender never came. There is a slight irony to the Blitz, because by 1945, the British and Americans had dropped 45,000 tons of bombs onto Berlin, double the amount of the London Blitz, using the same bombing tactics the Germans had used just a few years earlier. During the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe lost 1,733 aircraft, 40% of their fighters. Over 2,600 German pilots were killed or reported missing. For the RAF, 746 British fighters were lost and 520 pilots reported killed or missing. Britain remained in the fight, and 4 years later, on the 6th of June 1944, would be used as a springboard for the Allied invasion of France. This opened up a second land front and led to the surrender of Nazi Germany on 7th of May 1945.